Welcome back to Outside Views, and today we're discussing the latest, most absurd front in the interminable war of attrition that is post-Brexit life, and kinda a Brexit sausage war 2.0. The battle to save the humble British oat. And this isn't just about porridge, which I do like, by the way. This is a surreal, perfect distillation of the total political and bureaucratic breakdown caused by the UK's departure from the European Union. And the headline is both hilarious and deeply frustrating. British oats may be deemed too high for human consumption under existing EU rules in case of contamination. And my personal view is that this entire episode is an unmissable piece of dark comedy, a perfect metaphor for the political class's inability to see that friction is the inevitable suffocating cost of their choices. So kind of brilliant British humor. The sheer absurdity of a nation that helped invent the oat cake, now fighting to prevent its staple crop from being labeled too moldy by Brussels, is a tragicomic climax to a decade of self-inflicted wounds. And the core issue is highly technical, but brilliantly simple. It's mycotoxins. These are naturally occurring toxins produced by fungi, specifically mold, that proliferate in crops like oats when they are grown in damp coastal climates, like, for example, Britain's. The European Union, recognizing the potential health risks of mycotoxins, which, consumed at high levels, have been linked to kidney and liver damage and immune suppression, introduced stricter, lower maximum legislative levels for certain toxins, specifically T2 and HT2 toxins in 2024. The problem is that the UK's typical oat harvest, especially after damp, warm seasons, risks exceeding these newly tightened EU limits. British oats are particularly susceptible to this issue compared to other European cereals, especially concerning the T2 and HT2 toxins, with some historical data showing that a significant percentage of conventional oat samples in the UK could exceed the EU's former higher indicative levels. And the concern is that a large portion of the British oat harvest risks being condemned as unfit for human consumption under these EU rules, instantly making the crop unsellable, both to the huge EU market and, critically, potentially domestically. And this is where the current political failure becomes a full-blown crisis for farmers. The current government, seeking a Brexit reset with the EU, has prioritized negotiating a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, which would drastically ease the checks and bureaucratic nightmare on agri-food products traded across the Channel. However, to get this food and drink deal that the government claims could add billions to the economy, and that claim is probably absolutely correct, the UK has to agree to align agricultural policy with Brussels. And this dynamic alignment is precisely what brings the UK under the threat of the EU's tighter mycotoxin rules. As the president of the National Farmers Union, Tom Bradshaw, warns, this reset poses a significant threat to British cereal farmers. And he understands that the real worry isn't just limited exports to the EU, the first and obvious consequence, but that the UK may have to apply this new tighter regulation domestically, potentially condemning an entire crop as unsellable within the UK itself, threatening the supply of everyday products like porridge, oats, and oatcakes. And the outrage here is a sickening echo of the infamous Brexit sausage war, where the movement of chilled meats became an absurd political football. The difference this time is that the battle isn't about the principle of non-tariff barrier, it's about actual safety standards for a core food product driven by the UK's damp climate and the EU's regulatory tightening. And this whole episode perfectly exposes the central, inescapable falsehood of the entire Brexit project, the promise of taking back control to set its own rules. Just to throw that in for a second. Own rules on the cost of the health of their own citizens? But the reality is that for a major trading partner right on the EU's doorstep, there is no real control to be taken back. If the UK wants to sell its food to a market of 450 million people, its largest and most accessible market, it must align with the EU's rules. And if the UK diverges and sets lower standards, it faces unilateral border checks and effective market exclusion, or oats to be completely labeled as non-for-EU. And the current government's push for an SBS agreement is a necessary and pragmatic retreat from the ideological fantasy of total divergence, but the price of that retreat is the loss of sovereignty over domestic standards. And the oat crisis is the literal physical manifestation of that loss of control. It shows that taking back control actually means being forced to align with rules you no longer have a vote on, but where the political consequences, like a potential ban on your oats, are still entirely yours to manage. And the ultimate irony is the health perspective. The UK's Food Standards Agency's own 2014 study found that trace toxins in UK oat-based foods were comfortably below the tolerable daily intake. And the UK's own independent rules were reviewed recently and found to be adequate. And this suggests that the UK's current level of risk is deemed acceptable by its own experts. But because the EU, operating under different pressures and a different scientific model, decided to lower its standard for public health reasons. And the UK is now caught in a regulatory trap. So if the government successfully negotiates the reset, British farmers will be punished by a standard they did not vote for and which their own regulators deemed unnecessary. Although I have my doubts about that regulator. Health standards are not very negotiable for me. But if the government fails to negotiate a specific exemption, which the EU is not granting, it risks either crippling a domestic farming sector or abandoning the trade deal entirely, leading to a return to the customs nightmare. And it's an impossible choice that was created by the original decision to leave. And the oat crisis is a clear-cut example of how Brexit is not an abstract concept of sovereignty, but a direct attack on the livelihoods of farmers, if you want so, but also a challenge to the integrity of the food supply chain. But also on the other side is diverging an attack on the health of the people living there. The government spokesperson can talk all they want about a deal that will slash red tape and costs and add up about 5.1 billion a year to the economy. But the farmers will not be happy. But I'm sorry, I cannot be on the side of the farmers on that one. Even I'm living in a farming community here where I'm living, and I know a lot about farming since I live here. If our limits here from the farms around me would be that high that other countries say you cannot import that stuff, I would seriously start thinking about buying stuff. But the farmers are facing the possibility of having their entire harvest destroyed because their government in earlier times put them on the wrong side of the border they did not need. And it's a profound political disgrace that a basic historic foodstuff like the British oatcake has been rendered politically problematic by the sheer folly of the Brexit project. If Brexit never happened, the British, of course, would have been at the table when they were talking about the toxin levels. In the end, I'm quite sure they would have agreed to some extent. But they would have had time to prepare their farmers for measures. And I'm quite sure in many cases the oats and the damp weather might be a very special case. But usually in those cases you have time to prepare, you have time to help your farmers preparing for the new rules, etc. And this completely was lost because they were outside when the rules were made. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen.